The federal government just told the country that there are now 5 million fewer poisoned water pipes than there was a year ago. Nobody dug them up. Nobody replaced them. Nobody found clean copper underneath. The number changed in a press release. The same day, the agency announced new funding. Right now, a parent fills a bottle from a kitchen tap in a city that still does not know what its pipes are made of, and the dashboard behind that faucet just got quietly rewritten. So here's the question. How do you erase 5 million lead pipes without touching one of them? I work in water quality, and I want to be precise here because the chemistry and the paperwork are two completely different problems, and this entire story only makes sense once you stop letting people blur them together. The public version is simple. Lead pipes were a huge national problem. The number was around 9 million, and now, thanks to better data, it turns out the real number is closer to 4 million. Good news, apparently. Fewer pipes to fix, less money needed. Crisis smaller than we thought. Case closed, everybody go home. I don't believe that story, and I want to walk you through exactly why, because the reasoning matters more than my opinion does, and by the end, you're going to be doing this math yourself without me. And before anyone accuses me of being dramatic for the sake of it, most of the underlying 2024 survey data that people are now arguing over only became public because the NRDC had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to force the agency's hand. That's not a small detail. That's the difference between an agency volunteering transparency and an agency getting legally dragged into it. When a number that shapes billions of dollars in public health spending only surfaces because somebody had to compel its release, that tells you something about how confident the agency actually was in showing its work in the first place. Let's start with the number, because a number like this does not swing this hard for no reason. In 1991, the EPA estimated somewhere around 10 million lead service lines nationwide. In 2016, an industry trade group put it lower, around 6.1 million. In 2021, the NRDC ran its own independent survey and came back with a range of 9.7 to 12.8 million. In 2024, the EPA's own national survey, the 7th Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, landed at about 9.2 million. Then, on November 25th, 2025, the EPA cut that number by more than half, down to 4 million, in the exact same announcement where it revealed $3 billion in new lead line funding, plus another $1.1 billion in redistributed funds that had gone unspent. Read that sequence again, slowly. Every one of those swings happened around a survey update, a funding cycle, or a change in leadership at the agency. None of them happened because crews went out into the ground, dug up a pipe, and found copper where lead used to be. That's the first thing that should bother you. This isn't a story about pipes getting removed. It's a story about how pipes get counted, and counting is not the same thing as fixing. I'll say that twice because people skip past it. Counting is not fixing. Here's where it gets more specific and more annoying, because this is the part nobody explains on the evening news. The new 4 million figure comes from utility self-reported inventories, submitted under the lead and copper rule improvements, which required every water system in the country to file an inventory by October of 2024. Two states, Maryland and New Hampshire, did not voluntarily report their non-lead service line numbers at all. The EPA had to fill those gaps itself, using total connection counts instead of any verified inspection data. So part of this national number, the number now anchoring a multi-billion-dollar funding formula, is partly built on top of a state that never turned its homework in. I want to be fair here, because self-reporting isn't automatically dishonest. But think about the incentive structure for a second, because incentives explain almost everything in this field. A utility that reports a confirmed lead line takes on a legal replacement obligation and a public liability exposure. A utility that reports unknown material takes on neither of those things, at least not yet. Guess which category ballooned nationally? A huge share of American service lines are still sitting in that unknown bucket right now. Pipes nobody has physically confirmed one way or the other, not lead, not copper, not plastic, just unknown. And there's a category next to it that almost nobody talks about. Galvanized steel pipe downstream of a lead connection, sometimes called galvanized requiring replacement, because galvanized steel can absorb and later release lead that passed through it for decades. Depending on the year and the classification rules in use, those lines get counted as risk, or they quietly don't. That's not a footnote. That's millions of connections that can move in or out of the problem column depending on which spreadsheet tab someone opens. An unknown pipe is not a safe pipe. It is an unmeasured one. And when a large chunk of a national inventory shifts from lead into unknown or non-lead, trust us, the total count can drop by millions without a single wrench ever being turned. That's not remediation data, that's inventory reporting data, and those are two completely different animals wearing the exact same headline. Here's the part that really gets me. Professionally, most American water systems still don't have continuous, real-time lead monitoring at the tap. What they have is periodic sampling, a technician showing up on a schedule, filling a bottle, sending it to a lab, and waiting. If a chemistry shift causes a lead spike between two scheduled sampling dates, that spike can come and go completely undocumented. Nobody's watching in real time. There's no sensor sitting in most basements screaming the moment protective scale starts breaking down. The entire national safety picture is built on snapshots taken every few months, stitched together into a system that everyone treats as continuous coverage when it's actually closer to a flipbook with most of the pages missing. Now here's a design detail a lot of people get wrong, and it matters because it explains why this problem is concentrated exactly where it is, instead of being spread evenly across the country like you'd expect from simple old age. Illinois has more reported lead service lines than almost any other state, over 1 million of them, something close to a fifth of the entire national count sitting under one state's streets. That is not random geology, that is policy. Chicago's own local plumbing code required lead for household service connections well into the 1980s, years after most of the rest of the country had already moved on to safer materials. The federal government banned new lead pipe installation nationally in 1986. But a federal ban on new installations does absolutely nothing about the pipes already sitting in the ground, and the actual obligation to remove those existing lines doesn't fully come due until 2037. Sit with that gap for a second, because it's the whole scandal in one sentence. The ban is 1986. The deadline is 2037. That is over 50 years between "we know this is dangerous" and "we are legally required to take it out." That gap isn't an accident of bureaucracy. It is the policy. It's been running the entire time you assumed this was already handled. Picture what that actually looks like on a real street, because this isn't abstract. Under most older American cities, there's a paper map somewhere, sometimes decades old, sometimes hand annotated, showing which blocks got which material, and in a lot of cities, that map is incomplete or partially lost. A crew shows up to replace a water main for an unrelated reason, cuts into the ground, and finds a pipe nobody had confirmed in the current inventory. A pipe that's been quietly sitting there since before some of the residents on that block were born. That's not a hypothetical. That's the literal process by which a huge share of unknown lines eventually get reclassified, discovered by accident during unrelated construction work, rather than through any planned, funded verification effort. The system isn't hunting for these pipes, it's stumbling over them. And when the money finally does move to actually replace lines, the process runs through public procurement, contractors bidding for work, cities awarding contracts, timelines slipping the way infrastructure timelines always slip. That's not corruption by default, but it is another layer where a contract amount and a construction schedule can start looking like progress on paper long before a single additional foot of lead pipe actually comes out of the ground. A signed contract is not a completed replacement. Announced funding is not water flowing through copper. Those are different stages, and public reporting has a habit of treating the earliest stage like it's the finish line. Okay, right here is where I need people to slow down, because the next part explains why the old pipes are still there doesn't automatically mean crisis happening right now. A lead pipe that has been sitting quietly for decades often isn't leaching much of anything, because water chemistry builds up a thin mineral scale on the interior wall, frequently based on orthophosphate treatment, and that scale physically separates the lead metal from the water flowing past it. It's not a fix, it's a coating, a fragile one. Change the water source, change the pH, change the disinfectant chemistry even slightly, and that scale can destabilize, and lead that had been locked in place for 20 or 30 years starts releasing back into the water supply again. This is why a system can test clean for a decade and then fail within months of a completely unrelated decision made somewhere else in the treatment plant. The pipe didn't change. The chemistry protecting it did. That's the annoying part. It's invisible engineering, not a visible symptom like a green lake or a bad smell, so nobody notices until the blood tests come back wrong. And I want to be clear, the scale itself isn't some exotic technology. It's basically the water equivalent of a coat of paint, quietly forming a barrier one microscopic layer at a time, invisible to anyone standing at the sink. Lead doesn't announce itself. It doesn't turn the water green. It doesn't smell wrong. It doesn't leave a warning sign floating on the surface the way an algae bloom does. That's actually what makes this whole category of crisis so much harder to communicate than a visibly disgusting lake. A homeowner can see a bloom and know something's wrong. Nobody can see corrosion control chemistry quietly failing 3 feet under their kitchen floor. The lead does not care what quarter it is, what the funding announcement says, or what the dashboard was updated to display last Tuesday. It just responds to the chemistry sitting on top of it, the same way it always has. That single mechanism is the real story behind the 3 most famous American lead crises, and I want to walk through them together, because most people treat them as 3 separate, unrelated disasters. They're not. They're the same failure, wearing 3 different decades. Flint switched its water source without properly reestablishing corrosion control chemistry, and lead that had been stable for years came loose almost immediately. Washington, D.C., back in the early 2000s, changed its disinfectant approach, disrupted that same protective chemistry, and lived with elevated lead levels for years before the public fully understood what was happening to them. Newark, more recently, initially responded to its lead crisis by handing out bottled water before the underlying treatment chemistry problem was actually resolved, which treats the symptom in people's hands while the actual failure keeps running through the pipes in the ground. 3 cities, 3 decades, same root cause. Not the pipes are old. The pipes were old in all 3 cases for years before anything went wrong. The actual failure, every single time, was a chemistry change that nobody managed correctly, followed by a communication response that arrived after the damage instead of before it. That's the part that should make you angrier than the raw number does, honestly, because old infrastructure sounds like an act of God, something nobody could help. Mismanaged water chemistry sounds like exactly what it is, which is a choice, or a series of choices, made by people who had the tools to test for this in advance, and either didn't, or didn't act on it fast enough. And I want to be careful with that sentence, because I'm not accusing any one person of intent. I'm saying the tools existed. Corrosion control monitoring isn't new science. It's decades old. The failure isn't a knowledge gap. It's a management and communication gap, over and over in different zip codes. Now let's go back to the money, because the funding announcement and the shrinking pipe number arrived on the exact same day, and that timing is not something I'm willing to wave away. $3 billion a year in dedicated leadline funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law, plus another $1.1 billion redistributed from programs that hadn't spent their allocation yet. Here's the uncomfortable math. If the real national number is 4 million lines, that funding pool looks like it can nearly finish the job. If the real number is closer to 9 million, or the 9.7 to 12.8 million the NRDC has argued for using its own survey methodology, that exact same pool of money covers less than half the actual problem. The number the agency picked doesn't just describe the crisis anymore. It determines how big the response looks on paper. Cut the estimate in half, and suddenly the same dollar amount appears to solve twice as much. That's not remediation. That's arithmetic wearing a hard hat. I want to be careful here too, because I am not accusing anyone of fabricating a number specifically to make a budget look better. I don't have evidence of that, and I'm not going to pretend I do just because it would make a better story. What I can say, professionally and precisely, is that the timeline deserves scrutiny. The estimate dropped by more than half on the same day funding allocations were announced. The agency has not published a full public accounting of the exact methodology shift behind that drop, and the result of that combination is a headline that reads like a victory lap. That sequence, all on its own, without a single accusation attached to it, is enough to make anyone in this field ask a lot of annoying questions out loud. Here's another one nobody's asking loudly enough. Who actually pays to replace the section of pipe running under someone's own front yard? In most American cities, a service line has two owners. The utility owns the section under the street. The homeowner owns the section running from the property line into the house. Even inside publicly funded replacement programs, that private side segment can still land as a direct cost on the homeowner, sometimes thousands of dollars, frequently with no simple, guaranteed path to reimbursement. And the neighborhoods carrying the heaviest concentration of lead lines tend to be the exact same ones with the oldest housing stock and the least disposable income available to absorb a surprise plumbing bill. Flint, Newark, parts of Chicago, parts of Washington. This isn't a random distribution scattered across the map. It's the footprint of where cheap, fast, lead-friendly infrastructure got installed roughly a century ago. And it's the same footprint showing up today in who gets quietly told their neighborhood is lower priority, based on a count that was never actually verified pipe by pipe in the ground. Think about what lower priority actually means from inside a kitchen. It means a family keeps drinking through a line nobody has physically checked, based on a national category that was assembled, in part, from a state that skipped its own reporting requirement. It means a renter who doesn't even own the pipe under their own unit has no direct say in when or whether replacement money shows up on their block. It means a young family boiling water for formula, which does nothing for lead, because boiling concentrates it rather than removing it. None of that requires a villain either. It just requires a system that ranks its response using a number that was never independently verified street by street, and calls that ranking a priority list instead of what it actually is, which is a guess wearing an official seal. And remember, no amount of lead exposure has ever been shown to be safe. Not a little bit, not a trace, not under the threshold. Children absorb it into their bodies far more efficiently than adults do, and it accumulates quietly in growing nervous systems that don't get a second chance at development. That's not a scare line. That's the baseline public health position of the EPA and the CDC, and it's exactly why the number got smaller is not automatically the same thing as the danger got smaller. Let's talk about what a properly run system should actually be doing instead, because this is the standard of care question, and it's the one that exposes the whole approach for what it really is. A water system that takes this seriously verifies its lines physically, through excavation records, camera scoping, or documented material testing, before it ever makes a population-level claim about how safe its water supply is. It doesn't lean on self-reported categories stuffed with unknown and believed non-lead. It treats a national inventory the way a laboratory treats a sample. The data has to be verified before you build policy on top of it, not the other way around. That standard exists for a reason. A verified inventory tells you where to send crews first. It tells you which households need interim filters right now, while the physical replacement work is still years away. It tells regulators whether a 2037 deadline is actually achievable or whether it was set based on a number nobody had confirmed yet. Skip that verification step, and every decision downstream inherits the same uncertainty quietly without anyone flagging it. What actually happened here runs closer to the reverse order. A funding formula and a public safety narrative got constructed on top of an inventory that two states hadn't even finished filling out, with an unexplained methodology change layered somewhere underneath the entire structure. That is not a management plan. That is a wish with invoices attached to it. And this is where the monitoring gap becomes the scariest part of the whole story, scarier than the raw numbers themselves. If the true count really is 4 million, we can plan around that and largely close this out by 2037. But if the true count is closer to 9 million or higher, that 2037 deadline and the entire funding math built to hit it is already insufficient today, and we may not find that out for years. Not until the utilities currently sitting in the unknown column finally get around to digging in their own streets. The public was handed a number that felt like relief. What they actually received was an unverified estimate wearing the costume of a solved problem, resting on top of a legal deadline that assumes the estimate underneath it is correct. I keep coming back to the same frustration every single time I look at a story shaped like this one. It's never that the underlying science is some kind of mystery. It genuinely isn't. Lead pipes leach more when the water chemistry protecting them changes. That part has been understood for decades and is entirely preventable with proper corrosion control monitoring and honest inventory work. The actual mystery, if you can even call it that anymore, is always the management layer sitting directly on top of the science. Data collected after a crisis instead of before one. A public safety narrative built and published before the underlying inventory was fully verified. A funding formula calibrated to a number that conveniently shrank right around the moment the check was being written. None of that requires anyone involved to be a cartoon villain. It just requires an agency to treat measurement like a communications tool instead of a starting point for real decisions. And unfortunately, that is exactly the pattern running through 1991, through 2016, through 2021, through 2024, and now again through 2025. I want to be fair one more time before I close this out, because it's easy to make this sound like nothing has improved. Things have improved. There's more funding dedicated to this problem right now than there was a decade ago. There's a hard legal deadline that didn't exist before. States are required to inventory their systems in a way they never were previously. And that requirement, imperfect as it is still the reason we're even able to have this argument about which number is real. The problem isn't that nothing is happening. The problem is that the public keeps being handed a tidy final number, treated like a verdict, when what they're actually looking at is a work in progress wearing a finished coat of paint. So here's where I actually land on this. And I want to be precise instead of dramatic, because dramatic is easy and precise is genuinely harder to sit with. The pipes that were sitting in the ground last month are still sitting in the ground this month. Nothing about the physical infrastructure of American water systems changed on November 25th. What changed was a spreadsheet built on top of inventories that 2 states hadn't finished, categories with a built-in incentive to undercount, and a methodology the public still hasn't seen fully explained. That is not a fixed problem. That is a measured problem wearing the costume of a solved one. And water does not read press releases. It runs through whatever metal is actually sitting in the ground on whatever day the chemistry happens to shift, whether or not anybody remembered to update the number first.